But it's so nice and so wonderful for me to be able to start this whole process and start this release. The book just came out 2 days ago. In this community, I owe so much gratitude and thanks to so many of the people in this room, Ann Herman in the Women's Studies Department, Carol and Earwig. I'm also really honored that 2 of the really excellent research associates and assistants that worked with me on the project, Sarah McClellan and Sasha Firestein, are here. So it's really, really wonderful for me to start the project and start the kind of public recognition of what, for all of us, is a very kind of private process for a series of years in this particular manner. Now, before I get started, I'll just also say that I'm also grateful to the State Archives of Michigan, because before this project was anything, it was an archival project. I was looking around for a very different project from the one that I ended up writing about. I was interested in deinstitutionalization and race in Michigan, and was really looking for any hospital records in Michigan, because so many hospital records have been destroyed at this point, along with the actual the former state hospitals themselves. And stumbled upon an archivist at the State Archive, Mark Harvey, who really helped me uncover what had previously been an unseen archive of this Ionia State Hospital archive, and started to look at this process of what happened in this hospital over the course of time. Now again, initially I wasn't even focusing on schizophrenia, but what particularly interested me, and I'll be getting to it in about 30 minutes toward the end of this talk, but what particularly interested me about this archive was that Ionia had been a largely white Midwestern hospital in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and early 1950s. And many of the people who were in the hospital who were diagnosed with schizophrenia happened to be 30 or 40% of the hospital were women from the rural areas who had been arrested for different problems like shoplifting or disturbing the peace. They came and did all of these arts and crafts. It was a very kind of low stress environment. All of a sudden in the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s, the demographic of the hospital shifted quite radically, and what started to happen was that groups of African American men, largely from Detroit, started to be shipped up, bussed up, whatever, paddy-wagoned up to the hospital. And these men became the largest demographic group of the hospital, and also these were the men who became schizophrenic in a particular way. And so all of a sudden, the demographic of who was being diagnosed with schizophrenia shifted radically in the course of this institution. And really that was the opening question for me, which was, how was it that we got to this point where schizophrenia became an illness that so radically shifted in the confines of this hospital from one group to another? And what happened over the next 4 or 5 or 15 or 20 years, or however long you end up researching and writing about a particular project, was that I came to see this hospital as metaphorizing a series of much larger questions, series of much larger issues that really are at the intersection of race, psychiatry, and culture, played out over the course of this very charged time period. And really, in a way, this hospital was, on one hand, a very important local story, and at the same time, a metaphor for a very different kind of really civil rights history. What was happening in this hospital, away from the national glare, away from boycotts and sit-ins and television cameras, certainly. There was something else very much happening in response to civil rights, but it was a very silent story. So in the book, I try to tell that story. But let me start with some of the larger questions. I mentioned that I feel like this project actually ties into some of the bigger questions at the nexus of race and psychiatry. And what I'll do over the course of this talk is just address some of these bigger questions as a way of then getting back to the archive that I was just talking about. And so let me start with a kind of rhetorical question, which is, what is schizophrenia? As Carol just mentioned, I'm someone who has a split appointment at this university. I spend part of my time in the psychiatry, and a split mind, of course. Spend part of my time in the psychiatry department, and spend part of my time here, and part of my time playing basketball, as Ian knows. And so if you ask me on the days where I'm over in the psychiatry department, what is psychiatry? you would get an answer that is related to some of the issues on this particular slide, which is to say that if you ask me on a Monday or Tuesday afternoon when I'm over in clinic, or ask any of my colleagues in the psychiatry department, you would hear from them or from me that psychiatry is a biological illness that causes certain particular symptoms. And those symptoms include delusions, hallucinations, paranoia. Yes?
I have to say it. I think you mean schizophrenia is psychiatry.
That was a audience participation moment at this particular moment. So. Anyway, yeah, no, this is the straw man moment of the talk. So thank you for pointing that out too. So anyway, at those moments, people would say that schizophrenia is an illness that causes delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, etc., and that those particular symptoms, very serious symptoms, are caused by different types of brain anomalies in relation, of course, to cultural and developmental variants. But if you look in scientific literature, for example, you'll see different kinds of theories about what is held to be the biological basis of this particular illness. Everything from brain size or function findings to neurotransmitters. And one particular biological finding that's been present actually in psychiatric textbooks, at least as far as I can tell, for the past 25 years, is this finding, or this assumption basically, that because of biology or because of genetics, schizophrenia is an illness that occurs in 1% of the world's population, or 1 out of every 100 people, and it really shouldn't matter where you go, who you talk to, what kind of area you're in, irregardless of gender, race, class, social location. Schizophrenia is an illness that should occur in 1% of the world's population. So that's the biological part of this talk. And let me say that on the other hand, the material lives of people living with schizophrenia, and particularly men with schizophrenia, are shaped by a series of cultural perceptions, cultural issues, cultural factors that are seemingly at odds with a great deal of scientific research. And I want to highlight 2 of these particular cultural variants today. And one is the so-called misdiagnosis literature, the literature that basically says that if you are an African American man in the United States, this 1% number, you can pretty much pitch it out the window, because if you're a black man living in the United States, the chance that you'll be diagnosed, or what the literature argues is overdiagnosed with schizophrenia, is about 5 to 7 times greater than any other demographic group. And actually, this is a finding that I'll say in a minute has been very consistent. Some of this research actually come from the University of Michigan. But if you're a black man in the United States, basically, you're about 5 to 7 times more likely to be diagnosed or overdiagnosed with schizophrenia, and almost equally likely to be underdiagnosed with a condition such as depression or anxiety disorder or bipolar disorder. So cultural point number 1 is that there's a seeming tension here between what we might call the genetic arguments about schizophrenia and what happens when you add race to the mix in the real world. A second point, and one that I'll go into somewhat tangentially, is a related argument is not so much related to the biological findings of schizophrenia, but there also are a great number of studies that basically show that schizophrenia in cultural perception is also an illness that's not just racialized in a particular way. It's also assumed to be a particularly violent disorder. And so this is actually a study by Watson, Corrigan, and Adati that appeared in Psychiatric Services several years ago, where they gave 382 police officers a series of vignettes about different kinds of altercations. And in one altercation they said, there's a guy named Bob, he gets into a fight with a guy named Sam, Bob pushes Sam, they get into an argument, you're called to the scene, what do you do? And in vignette number 2, it's there's a guy named Bob who has schizophrenia. He gets into a fight with a guy named Sam. Bob pushes Sam. You're called to the scene. What do you do? So the same seemingly minimally violent vignette. All they did was add the word schizophrenia to this particular vignette. And what they found was that police officers' perceptions that the person who was the perpetrator of this incident as being violent, needing some kind of restraint, needing some kind of incarceration, went from something like 15 or 19% to upwards of 60% simply by adding this one word, schizophrenia. In other words, just by adding this one word, the perception of violence, the perception of threat, expanded expanded greatly. And lest you think that this is a finding that's just related to the police, this study has actually been repeated, most notably by a series of sociologists at Columbia, Lincoln, Phelan. And what they do is look at popular attitudes and show exactly the same thing, that if you add the word schizophrenia to these vignettes, people's perceptions of violence raise exponentially. Now, let me just say that about these two findings, race and schizophrenia, I realize that they are topics of controversy, and in a way that's why I've taken them on.